Here is the number that matters. At sea level, the atmosphere presses on your body with about 1 kilogram of force for every square centimeter of you. You have carried that your whole life, and you have never noticed it because you are mostly water, and water does not compress, go down 10 meters, and that doubles. 10 more, it triples. The rule is simple, and it does not stop. Every 10 meters of seawater adds the weight of an entire atmosphere. At 200 meters, which is nothing, which is the shallow edge of the continental shelf, which is a depth the ocean averages 4,000 meters of, you are carrying 21 atmospheres. Your bones are fine. Your muscles are fine. Water does not compress, so most of you simply does not care. What kills you is the gas. Under pressure, the air you breathe dissolves into your blood and tissue, not into your lungs, into you. Nitrogen goes into your fat, your spinal cord, your joints, your brain. The deeper you go and the longer you stay, the more of it you absorb, and it stays absorbed as long as the pressure holds. Come up slowly and it leaves the way it came, quietly through your lungs. Come up fast and it does what a shaken bottle does. The gas comes out of solution inside you. Bubbles form in your joints first, and that is the pain that made 19th century caisson workers bend double, which is where the name comes from. Then the spinal cord, then the brain. That is the constraint every human being who has ever gone deep has had to work around. And in the 1960s, the offshore industry found a way around it that is stranger than the problem. It works like this. Your tissues can only hold so much dissolved gas. Once they are completely full, saturated, they stop taking on more. And here is the part that changes everything. Once you are saturated, the time it takes to safely decompress stops going up. A man who has been at pressure for 2 days and a man who has been at pressure for a month need the same decompression. So the industry stopped bringing them up. Saturation divers live at pressure. They are sealed into a steel chamber on the deck of a rig. The chamber is pressurized to match the depth they will be working at, and they stay there for 28 days. They sleep in it. They eat food passed through an airlock. They breathe a mix of helium and oxygen, because nitrogen at that pressure makes you stupid and then unconscious, and helium does not, although helium raises the pitch of the human voice so far that surface control needs electronic processing to understand a word anyone says. Every day they transfer into a diving bell, the bell is lowered, they work, and they come back to the chamber. Never to the surface. The bell is at the same pressure. The chamber is at the same pressure. Their bodies never change state. At the end of the month, they are decompressed slowly over days. Think about what that actually means. For 28 days, those men are not reachable. Not by a helicopter, not by a doctor, not by a mother who has been told something has happened. If a man in saturation has a heart attack, nobody can open the door. Opening the door kills him and everyone with him. He is on the deck of the rig, 4 steps from open air, and he is as isolated as if he were on the seafloor, because in every way that matters to his body, he is. On the 5th of November 1983, somebody opened the door. The Byford Dolphin was a semi-submersible drilling rig working the Frigg gas field, roughly 200 kilometers off the Norwegian coast in the North Sea. It was 4 in the morning. 4 saturation divers were inside the chamber system, held at 9 atmospheres, the pressure of about 80 meters of water. Edwin Coward, Roy Lucas, Bjorn Bergersen, Truls Hellevik. 2 tenders were working outside. William Crammond and Martin Saunders. The bell had been brought up and connected to the chamber system through a short passage called a trunk. The sequence was routine and it had a strict order to it. Close the bell door, close the chamber door, bleed the pressure out of the trunk. Then, and only then, release the clamp. The clamp was released while the trunk was still pressurized and the doors were still open. 9 atmospheres went to 1 in a fraction of a second. The 3 men further inside died where they lay. The autopsies found something that had not been documented before. The fat in their blood had come out of solution and solidified. The dissolved gas had erupted through their circulation so violently that it denatured the lipoproteins carrying fat through their bodies, and the fat separated out. They did not drown, and they did not suffocate. Their blood turned into something that was no longer blood, and it happened faster than a nerve signal travels. Hellevik was stand standing in the doorway. He was the one closing the door. He was directly in the path of the escaping gas, and the gap he was standing in was a fraction of the width of a man. I am not going to describe what happened to him. The pathologist who wrote the report needed technical language to do it, and I do not think it belongs in a video. Outside, the escaping pressure threw the diving bell across the deck. It killed Cramond. Saunders survived. For 25 years, the accepted explanation was that Cramond made a mistake. He was named in the original finding, and he was dead and could not answer. In 2008, the case was reopened, and the conclusion changed. The system on the Byford dolphin had been built to rules written in 1975. Those rules said nothing about how the clamp should be designed. In 1982, a year before the accident, the rules were updated, and the update required a mechanical interlock, a coupling that physically cannot be opened while there is pressure behind it. The rig had not been modified. Every saturation system in the world has that interlock now. 5 men died to install a piece of metal that makes a specific human error impossible to commit. There is a second limit, and this one has no engineering solution. Because it is not in the equipment, helium solved the nitrogen problem, but somewhere below about 150 meters, divers breathing helium start to shake. It begins in the hands, then the arms. Nausea follows, then a specific kind of cognitive dimming, men who can still work but cannot hold a thought, who read a gauge and cannot say what it read. On long dives, the electrical activity of the brain itself changes measurably. It is called high-pressure nervous syndrome, and the leading explanation is that it is pressure acting directly on the nerve cells, not on gas dissolved in them. On the cells, you can add other gases to soften it. You can descend more slowly. You cannot remove it, because at a certain depth, the pressure is no longer something a human body is inside of. It is something acting on the human body's ability to be a human body. The deepest that commercial saturation diving normally operates is a few hundred meters. Below that, we send machines. Not because we cannot build a better suit, because the animal inside the suit has a ceiling, and we found it. Now go back up and go sideways instead. The North Sea, where the Byford dolphin was working, is shallow. Most of it is under 100 meters. It is one of the most heavily fished, most heavily drilled, most thoroughly mapped stretches of water on the planet. For a long time, fishing boats working the Dogger Bank kept bringing up things that did not belong in a net. Mammoth teeth, woolly rhinoceros bone, antler worked into tools by hand, with the cut marks still in them, the occasional human bone. The nets were dragging the floor of a country. 10,000 years ago, there was no North Sea between Britain and Denmark. There was land, river valleys, marshland, lakes, forest, and the people who lived on it. Archaeologists call it Doggerland. It was not a land bridge, some narrow strip you crossed to get somewhere else. It was the good part. Low, wet, full of fish and game, and by every reconstruction we have, better country than the higher ground that survived. The ice was melting and the sea was coming up. That much was slow, and slow is survivable. You move inland, your grandchildren move again, and nobody in any single lifetime watches the world end. Then, roughly 8,200 years ago, a section of the continental slope off western Norway broke away. The Storegga Slide is one of the largest known submarine landslides on Earth. A piece of the seafloor the size of a small country detached and moved, and the water above it had to go somewhere. It went outward. Deposits from the wave it produced have been found in Norway, in Scotland, in the Faroes, in Denmark, and in East Greenland. In the Shetland Isles, the run-up has been estimated at up to 20 meters. Doggerland was flat, low, and directly in front of it, researchers still argue about whether the wave finished Doggerland or simply arrived at the end of a long drowning that was going to finish it anyway. That argument is real and it is not settled. What is not in question is that after that date, the archaeological signal of people living there stops. There is no monument. There is no name that survived. Because whatever those people called their own country was spoken and not written, and everyone who could have said it out loud is under 100 feet of cold water off the coast of England, and has been for 8,000 years. Fishermen still bring up the bones. It happens often enough that there is a process for handing them in. That is the shallow water. That is the part of the ocean we have mapped, drilled, fished, and lived above for our entire history as a species. The average depth of the ocean is around 3,700 meters. We have not started. Color dyes in order. Red goes almost immediately. Water absorbs the long wavelengths first, so by 10 meters red is already gone, and anything red at that depth is simply black. Orange follows, then yellow around 30 meters. Green holds on longer by 200 meters, blue is all that is left, and there is not much of it. Enough to see by. Not enough for a plant to live on. 200 meters is the depth where photosynthesis stops being possible anywhere on Earth, which means it is the floor of every food chain that runs on sunlight. Below that is a layer of water that goes down another 800 meters. Biologists call it the mesopelagic. Everyone else calls it the twilight zone, and it is the largest habitat on the planet by volume, larger than every forest, desert, grassland, and ice sheet on the surface put together. But almost nothing that lives there has ever been seen alive by a human being. Here is the thing about a place with a small amount of light instead of none. If there were no light at all, eyes would be useless and animals would have abandoned them. If there were plenty of light, you would hide behind rocks or plants or coral, the way things do in shallow water. The twilight zone has neither. It has a faint blue glow coming down from above, and it has nothing at all to hide behind. No floor, no walls. Water in every direction for hundreds of kilometers, so the animals that live there hide inside the light itself. Look up from below in the twilight zone and you see a dim blue ceiling. Anything swimming between you and that ceiling appears as a black shape against it, a silhouette. That is how predators they hunt. They swim underneath everything and look up, which means the countermove is obvious once you see the problem. You cannot become transparent, not entirely, but you can produce your own light on your underside, match its brightness to the light coming down, and erase yourself. It is called counter-illumination, and a very large number of animals in that layer do it. Photophores along the belly, angled downward, adjusted in real time. Some species can match the intensity of the light above them as it changes. Some tune the color. There are squid that can adjust for the phase of the moon. Sit with that. In a layer of ocean 800 meters thick, encircling the entire planet, there are animals right now performing continuous calculations about how bright the sky is so that a thing beneath them does not see a shadow. And this is where light stops being illumination and becomes something else entirely. Everything below 200 meters that produces light is producing it for a reason, and almost none of those reasons are about seeing. Consider what happens when the trick fails. There is a jellyfish called a toller. It lives in the deep, it is red, which in a place with no red light means invisible, and when something attacks it, it does not fight and it does not flee. It turns on, a ring of blue light runs around its bell in a rotating pattern, bright and rhythmic, visible for a very long distance in clear black water. It does not blind the attacker, it does not startle it, it advertises. Researchers call it the burglar alarm. The jellyfish is broadcasting a signal that says, "Something is eating me," at these coordinates right now. And the only creatures who benefit from that information are things large enough to eat whatever is currently eating the jellyfish. The strategy only works if you assume there is always something bigger in the dark, close enough to come. In the twilight zone, that assumption is apparently reliable enough to have evolved into a defense. The people studying this eventually built an electronic version of the alarm to attract predators to their cameras. It worked. Food is the other problem, and it shapes the bodies down here more than the darkness does. In shallow water, an animal eats every day. In the twilight zone, a meal might arrive once a week. It might arrive once a month. Nothing grows here, so everything that lives here is eating something that came from somewhere else, which means the arrival of food is a random event that produces a specific kind of design. If you cannot control when you eat, you must be able to eat anything of any size the moment it appears. There is a fish called the black swallower. It is about the length of your hand, 25 centimeters at most, and it lives between roughly 700 and 2,700 meters. Its upper jaw is hinged to its skull in a way that lets the whole mouth swing down and forward, so the opening is wider than the fish's own head. Its teeth are hooked and they fold backward to let prey in, then interlock so it cannot come out. Its stomach is elastic and thin enough to be translucent. It can swallow a fish twice its own length and 10 times its own mass. Whole. Alive, the prey does not fit inside the body, so the body changes shape around it. The stomach distends until you can see the outline of the swallowed fish through the swallower's skin, curled, intact, pressed against the inside of an animal a fraction of its size. Then digestion begins, and this is where the design has a failure mode. If the meal is too large, it starts to decompose before it can be broken down. Decomposition produces gas. The gas has nowhere to go. The stomach inflates, and a fish that is now less dense than the water around it begins to rise. It rises through 800 meters of water it has never been near. It rises into pressure it cannot survive, and light it has no defense against, and temperature it is not built for, and it dies on the way, and it arrives at the surface as a small black corpse with an intact fish visible inside it. That is how most black swallowers ever recovered by science were found. Floating. Killed by eating. Not everything down here is solving the food problem. Some of them are solving the seeing problem, and one solution is strange enough that it went unrecognized for half a century. There is a fish called the barrel eye. Its eyes are tubular, pointed straight up, and extremely sensitive, which is what you want if you are hunting silhouettes against a dim ceiling. That much was known from trawled specimens for decades. What the trawls destroyed every single time was the rest of the head. The barrel eye's skull is capped with a transparent dome filled with clear fluid, and the eyes sit inside it. Its eyes are not on the outside of the animal. They are enclosed within its own head, looking out through a window in the top of its skull. It was not photographed intact until researchers observed one alive at depth from a submersible. And when they did, they found something the dead specimens could never have shown them. The eyes rotate. The fish can swing them from pointing straight up to pointing forward, inside the transparent shell without moving its body at all. The two dark spots on the front of its face that everyone assumes are eyes are not eyes. They are nostrils. One more thing lives at these depths, and it does not belong here. Cuvier's beaked whale is a mammal. It has lungs, it breathes air, and it comes to the surface for about 2 minutes at a time, and then it goes down. The species holds the depth record for any marine mammal ever recorded, close to 3,000 meters. But the number that broke the science is not the depth. Based on its body size, its oxygen stores, and its metabolism, researchers calculated that a Cuvier's beaked whale should be able to hold its breath for about 33 minutes before running out of oxygen and switching to anaerobic respiration, which is the biological equivalent of running an engine without cooling it. A team from Duke University tagged 23 of them off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, and recorded 3,680 foraging dives across 4 years. In 2017, one animal stayed down for 3 hours and 42 minutes, more than 7 times the predicted limit. The previous record from the same species had been just over 2 hours. The researchers said openly that they did not believe the data at first. They also expected the whale to need a long recovery at the surface afterwards. There was no clear pattern. One animal went back down 20 minutes after a 2-hour dive. Nobody has a complete explanation. The current thinking involves an unusually low metabolism, larger oxygen stores than expected, and a tolerance for lactic acid that would incapacitate almost any other mammal. That is a description of the effect, not a mechanism. There is an animal that goes deeper and stays under longer than we can account for, and it does it every day, and it has been doing it for millions of years, and we found out by accident because someone glued a tag to one of them. At 1,000 meters, the last blue is gone. Not dim, gone. There is no measurable sunlight below this line, and everything from here to the bottom of the ocean has never seen any. That is roughly 90% of the habitable volume of the planet. Look at what is falling through the light. It has been on screen since the first minute of this film. Small pale flecks, drifting down, never stopping, so constant that after a while the eye stops registering them as anything at all. Every one of those is dead. Marine snow is the general term, and it is a polite one. What it actually consists of is the remains of the plankton that lived and died in the sunlit water above. Bacteria, mucus, shed body parts, larvae that never developed, and the fecal pellets of everything larger. It clumps together as it descends and picks up more on the way down. It falls continuously everywhere in the ocean and has done for hundreds of millions of years. A single flake can take weeks to reach the bottom. That is the food supply. That is the entire food supply. Below the depth where sunlight ends, there is no primary production of any kind that runs on light, so every living thing from here to the sea floor is ultimately eating something that died in a world it will never see. Almost all of it gets intercepted on the way down. The deeper you go, the less arrives, because everything above you has already taken its share. By the time you reach the abyssal plain, only a small fraction of what was produced at the surface is still falling, which means the animals down here are not competing for food in the way animals do on land. They are waiting under a very slow, very thin, permanent drizzle of corpses, and occasionally the drizzle delivers something enormous. When a whale dies at sea, it usually sinks. 30 or 40 tons of flesh and bone arrive on the seafloor in a single event. For the animals living there, this is not a meal, it is a geological occurrence. A quantity of carbon lands in one spot that would otherwise have taken that patch of seabed centuries to accumulate through marine snow. They found the first one by accident in 1987 when the submersible Alvin came across a whale skeleton on the floor of the Santa Catalina Basin. Nobody had planned for it. Nobody had really thought about what happens to a dead whale. What happens is a succession, and it runs in stages, and it lasts longer than most human careers. The first stage begins within hours. Scavengers arrive, and the ones that arrive first are hagfish and sleeper sharks and swarms of amphipods, and they can strip most of the soft tissue in a matter of months. The rate is startling. Something on the order of tens of kilograms a day disappears into animals that came from kilometers away, following the smell through water in the dark. The second stage begins when the meat is gone. Now the bones are surrounded by sediment saturated in whale fat and whale tissue, and a completely different set of animals moves in. Polychaete worms, crustaceans, mollusks, tens of thousands of individuals living in the enriched mud around the skeleton. This lasts a year or two. The third stage is the long one. Whalebone is roughly 60% lipid by weight. Whalebone is full of oil. Bacteria colonize the skeleton and break that oil down, and the process releases hydrogen sulfide. And hydrogen sulfide is the same chemical that fuels the ecosystems around deep-sea hot vents. So a whale's skeleton becomes a chemical island. It supports mussels and clams and tube worms that are related to vent species and have no business existing on an open sedimentary plain, and it supports them for decades. Estimates run to 50 years and beyond for a large animal. Somewhere on the floor of the Pacific right now, there is a skeleton with a functioning ecosystem on it, made of an animal that died before most people watching this were born, and then there is what happens to the bone itself. In 2002, researchers working the Monterey Canyon sent a submersible down to about 2,900 meters and found a grey whale skeleton. The bones were covered in something red and feathery that nobody recognized. They brought samples up, and the identification took a while because the animal did not make sense. It is a worm. It has no mouth. It has no stomach, no gut, and no anus. It has no mechanism for eating anything in the sense that word is normally used. What it has instead is a root system. The green structure at its base grows down into the whalebone, and it does that by secreting acid and dissolving the bone chemically the way a plant root works into stone. Inside those roots live symbiotic bacteria, and the bacteria break down the collagen and the lipids locked in the skeleton and feed the worm from the inside. The name they gave it is Ostax. It means bone devourer. There is one more thing about them. Every visible Ostax on a whale skeleton is female. The males exist, but they never grow up. They settle inside the tube of a female as larvae, and they simply stop developing, remaining microscopic, still carrying the yolk they hatched with, living off it until it runs out. A single female can have dozens of them inside her, in some cases more than 100. They never leave, they never feed, and they never become anything other than a source of sperm. That is a functioning, successful, globally distributed animal, and it is built out of a female that eats bone chemically and a harem of permanent larvae in her body cavity. Which brings us to the other solution to the same problem. The problem is this: the deep sea is enormous, it is dark, and it is nearly empty. If you are an animal down here and you need to find a mate, the odds are against you in a way that is difficult to convey. You may go your entire life without encountering another member of your species. Deep sea anglerfishes solved it, and the solution is the most extreme thing in vertebrate biology. The female is the fish everyone pictures: the lure, the teeth, the size. The male of some species is a fraction of her length. He has no functional lure, and in several species, a digestive system that shuts down as he matures. He has enormous nostrils and enormous eyes, and one job: when he finds her, he bites on. Then he does not let go, his mouth fuses to her skin. The tissues merge, their circulatory systems join so that his blood is her blood, and he stops needing to eat because she is feeding him. His eyes degenerate, his fins degenerate, his internal organs degenerate, all of them except the ones that make sperm. What is left after weeks is a lump on the female's flank that used to be an animal. In some species, she carries more than one. Now, here is the part that stopped an entire field of immunology, and it is not the romance of it. It is a question nobody had thought to ask. When you transplant tissue between two individuals of the same species, the recipient's immune system attacks it. This is why organ transplantation requires tissue matching and lifelong immunosuppressant drugs. The system responsible is the major histocompatibility complex, and its whole function is to distinguish self from not self. It is one of the most fundamental features of vertebrate life. Two anglerfish fuse their circulatory systems permanently, and nothing rejects anything. In 2020, a team from the Max Planck Institute of Immunobiology and Epigenetics in Freiburg, working with the University of Washington, sequenced tissue from 31 preserved specimens across species that never attach, species that attach temporarily, and species that fuse permanently. The pattern was clean and it was brutal. Species where the male attaches temporarily have lost the functional genes underpinning antibody maturation. Species where the male fuses permanently have lost more, and in some of them the RAG genes are gone entirely, which abolishes the process that generates diverse antibodies and T-cell receptors in the first place. That process is the defining feature of adaptive immunity in every vertebrate that has it. These fish gave up the immune system that every other backboned animal on Earth depends on, and they did it so that two bodies could become one. They are, by species count, the most successful group of vertebrates in the deep ocean. There is one place on Earth where none of this happens. The Black Sea looks ordinary. People swim in it. There are resorts along it. The top 150 meters or so is normal seawater with normal life in it. Below that, there is no oxygen at all. The sea is layered and it does not mix, because dense salt water enters along the bottom from the Mediterranean and fresh river water sits on top of it, and the two have stayed separated for thousands of years. Beneath the boundary, the water is anoxic and saturated with hydrogen sulfide, and roughly 90% of the sea's total volume is like that. Nothing lives there. No fish, no worms, no bacteria that need oxygen, and critically, none of the organisms that eat wood. So when a ship sinks in the Black Sea and passes that line, nothing happens to it. Between 2015 and 2017, a survey led by the University of Southampton mapped the seabed off the Bulgarian coast and found more than 60 wrecks spanning about 2,500 years of seafaring. Ottoman vessels. A medieval Venetian trader, nearly a kilometer down, with its masts still up, and in the final season, about 80 kilometers out from Burgos and more than 2 kilometers down, they found a Greek merchant ship 23 meters long. Radiocarbon dated to around 400 BC, the mast is standing. The rudders are in place. The rowing benches are where the rowers left them. The cargo is still in the hold. Ships of that design were known to archaeology from exactly one source. Paintings on Greek pottery. The closest match is a vase in the British Museum showing Odysseus tied to a mast, listening to the sirens, painted around 80 years before this particular ship went down. The ship in the painting and the ship on the seafloor are the same ship. It has been sitting there, intact, in water with no oxygen in it, since a century before Alexander. Everywhere else in the ocean, the dead are consumed. That is the rule, and this entire act has been about the machinery that does it. The Black Sea is what it looks like when the machinery is switched off 4,000 meters. Below this, the seafloor stops being a plain and starts being something else. For most of the 19th century, the accepted scientific position was that nothing lived down here. In 1843, a British naturalist named Edward Forbes dredged the Aegean Sea and noticed that the deeper he went, the less he brought up. He extrapolated the trend and concluded that below roughly 550 meters the ocean was lifeless. He called it the Azoic Zone. It was a reasonable inference from the data he had. No light, no plants, no food, crushing pressure, near freezing temperatures. Nothing could live there, and therefore nothing did. That idea held for decades. And even after biologists disproved the strong version of it, the underlying picture survived much longer than the hypothesis did. The deep ocean as a cold, dark, essentially empty basin. Static, unchanging, nothing happening. Which made it look like the safest place on Earth to put things you did not want. Every part of that picture is wrong. We established that in stages, and in most cases we established it after we had already acted on the assumption. The first correction came in February 1977, and it was an accident. A team of geologists took the submersible Alvin down to a spreading ridge near the Galapagos Islands, about 2,500 meters deep. They were looking for hot water. Theory predicted that where the seafloor pulls apart, seawater should sink into the crust, heat, and come back up. And nobody had ever seen it happen. They found the hot water. What nobody had predicted was what was standing around it. Clams the size of dinner plates, crabs, mussel beds, tube worms in dense clusters, some of them 2 meters tall, in an area of seafloor that the surrounding plain could not possibly have supported. There was no biologist on the dive. There was no biologist on the ship. This was a geology expedition, and the samples they brought up were preserved in vodka from the galley because nobody had thought to bring the correct chemicals. The explanation took months to work out, and it changed the definition of life on this planet. The water coming out of those vents is loaded with hydrogen sulfide, which is poisonous to nearly everything. There are bacteria down there that oxidize it and use the energy from that reaction to build sugar out of carbon dioxide. In exactly the way a plant does with sunlight. The process is called chemosynthesis. It means the entire ecosystem around a hydrothermal vent runs on chemistry from inside the Earth and owes nothing at all to the sun. Until 1977, every food chain anyone had ever studied began with light. Everyone. That was not a rule anyone had bothered to write down, because it did not need writing down. The animals themselves are built around the arrangement. The giant tube worms have no digestive system to speak of. They have an organ packed with those bacteria, and the worm's job is to deliver raw material to them. Its blood carries oxygen and hydrogen sulfide at the same time in the same hemoglobin, which is a combination that would kill nearly any other animal, because sulfide normally destroys the ability of blood to carry oxygen at all. Then there is the worm that lives on the chimney itself. It is called the Pompeii worm, and it builds a tube on the outer wall of an active vent, which puts its tail end in water far hotter than any complex animal was thought to tolerate. Its head sits in cooler water at the tube opening. The precise temperature its tail withstands has been argued about for 20 years, and the estimates have come down since the first reports, but the arrangement itself is not in dispute. This animal lives with one end of its body in water that would cook it and the other end in water that will not. And on vents in the Indian Ocean, there is a snail whose shell is reinforced with iron. It incorporates iron sulfide into its scales and its shell, taking the metal from the vent fluid. It is the only animal known to do this. In 2019, it became one of the first species to be listed as endangered specifically because of the threat of deep-sea mining, before any commercial mining had taken place. That is the correction to empty. Here is the correction to static, and it came from an unrelated direction entirely, because nobody was looking for it. On the 18th of November 1929, an earthquake struck under the Grand Banks off Newfoundland. It was felt on land. It caused a tsunami that killed people in the villages on the coast, and it did one other thing that seemed like a footnote at the time. It broke the transatlantic telegraph cables, 12 of them. That in itself was not surprising. What was strange was the pattern, and the pattern only became visible because the cable companies logged the exact moment each line went dead. The cables closest to the epicenter broke first. Then the next one's out. Then the next. The breaks marched southward down the continental slopes, in order over a period of roughly 13 hours, each cable failing later than the one above it and earlier than the one below it. Something had moved down the slope and cut them one at a time. It took until 1952 for two geologists at Columbia to work out what. The earthquake had shaken loose an enormous volume of sediment, and that sediment had mixed with water into a dense slurry heavier than the seawater around it, and it had flowed downhill. They are called turbidity currents, because the sequence of cable breaks gives you a distance and a time for each one. The 1929 event is the only reason anyone could calculate a speed, and the numbers that come out of it describe an avalanche moving down the seafloor faster than a car on a motorway for hundreds of kilometers, carrying enough material to bury a small country. The deep ocean floor is not static. It has landslides, and they are among the largest movements of material anywhere on the planet, and until a set of telegraph cables happened to be lying across one, nobody knew they existed. Visual. Return to seafloor. Depth marker, 900 meters, a deliberate step back up, then 1,800 meters between 1946 and 1970. The United States dumped more than 47,800 drums of low-level radioactive waste into the ocean west of San Francisco. 3 sites were designated for it. About 150 drums were meant to go at 90 meters, 3,600 at 900 meters, and 44,000 at 1,800 meters. That is where they were meant to go. In practice, weather and navigation being what they were, many of the barrels went over the side wherever the ship happened to be. The current best understanding is that they are scattered across roughly 1,400 square kilometers of seafloor, and the true distribution is not known. As of the surveys that have been done, only a fraction of the area has ever been mapped. Steel drums are buoyant when they are sealed. Some of them refuse to sink. The recorded solution was to shoot them until they filled with water. The nearest of those sites is around 30 miles from the Golden Gate Bridge. Much of the area now lies inside a national marine sanctuary, which was designated in 1981, 11 years after the dumping stopped. It was legal. It was authorized. It was done on the understanding that the deep ocean was large, empty, and stable, and that anything put into it was effectively gone. One more, and this one is the clearest measurement we have of how wrong the assumption was. In March 1979, a 9-meter-wide prototype mining machine was lowered onto the seafloor of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone in the central Pacific between Hawaii and Mexico. It weighed about 100 tons. It drove in a loop, scraping up the metal-rich nodules that lie on the sediment there, and it disturbed roughly 4/10 of a square kilometer before it was brought back up. In 2023, a British team went back to find the tracks. They found them immediately. The furrows are 1 to 3 meters wide and up to 80 centimeters deep, and they are described in the published paper as looking almost as though they were made the day before. 44 years of ocean had done essentially nothing to them. The reason is a single number. Sediment accumulates on that part of the seafloor at a rate of somewhere between 1.5 and 11 millimeters per 1,000 years. Not per year. Per 1,000 years. The animals that live in the sediment have partially come back. The large ones that anchor themselves to the nodules have not, because the machine took the nodules, and the nodules take millions of years to form. Those tracks will be visible for longer than our species has existed. 6,000 meters. The abyssal plain ends here, and what comes next is not a plain at all. Below 6,000 meters, the ocean stops being one thing. Everything above this depth is connected. The abyssal plain is continuous. An animal on the floor of the Atlantic and an animal on the floor of the Pacific are separated by distance, but not by anything it could not, in principle, cross. What lies below 6,000 meters is not a deeper floor. It is a set of holes in the floor. These are the trenches, and there are roughly 46 of them, and they form where one tectonic plate slides underneath another. They are long and narrow and steep, and each one is surrounded on every side by an abyssal plain that is 4 or 5 kilometers shallower than the trench itself. For an animal adapted to handle pressure, that shallower ground is a wall. It cannot cross it. Its biochemistry is tuned to conditions that only exist at the bottom of the hole it was born in, so the deepest places on Earth are islands. Isolated from each other by depth instead of by water, each one accumulating its own species over millions of years, most of which exist nowhere else and never will. There is more vertical distance between the abyssal plain and the bottom of the Mariana Trench than there is between sea level and the summit of most mountain ranges, and it is repeated separately 46 times around the edges of the Pacific and in scattered places elsewhere, and almost none of it has been visited. There is a hard line down here, and it is not made of pressure directly. It is made of one molecule. Pressure does not crush deep-sea animals because they contain no air. What pressure does is more insidious than crushing. Proteins are long chains folded into precise shapes, and the shape is the function. Under enough hydrostatic pressure, those shapes begin to deform. The protein is still there and it no longer works. Marine fish counter this with a compound called trimethylamine N oxide. It sits alongside the proteins and holds them in shape against the pressure. Chemists call this class of molecule a piezolyte. The deeper a fish lives, the more of it the fish carries. The relationship is close to linear, and it has been measured across hundreds of species. From the surface down to about 4,800 meters, the concentration rises roughly sixfold. And that is the problem, because TMAO is also a solute, and solutes affect the movement of water across membranes. As a fish loads more of it into its tissues, the fish's internal fluid becomes progressively saltier relative to the sea around it. At some point the two match. When a fish's internal concentration equals seawater, it can no longer control the flow of water into its own body. It would take on water and be unable to stop. In 2014, a team led by Yancey captured a hadal snailfish at 7,000 meters, measured the highest TMAO concentration ever recorded in a fish, and extrapolated the line forward to find where it crosses. The answer is about 8,200 meters. That is not a limit for one species. It is the calculated limit for every bony fish on this planet. Then somebody went and checked. Over the following decade, a research program deployed baited cameras into deep trenches around the world hundreds of times. In August 2022, off Japan, in the Izu-Ogasawara Trench, one of those cameras filmed a juvenile snailfish at 8,336 meters. It is the deepest fish ever recorded. Days later, in the neighboring Japan Trench, two more were caught in traps at 8,022 meters. The first fish ever physically recovered from below 8 kilometers. The team's lead described the pattern from 500 camera deployments in plain terms. Almost every recording down to 8,336 meters has fish in it. Below that, they simply stopped. The cameras on that same expedition went down to 9,773 meters. Nothing. A prediction made from a chemistry measurement in 2014 turned out to describe, within about 100 meters, an invisible ceiling that runs around the entire planet, below which no vertebrate exists. There is nearly 3 kilometers of ocean beneath that line. Fish have had 400 million years to reach it. They cannot. On the 23rd of January 1960, two men went down there in a steel sphere. The bathyscaphe Trieste carried Jacques Piccard and Lieutenant Don Walsh into the Challenger Deep, the lowest point in the Mariana Trench and the lowest point on Earth. The descent took about 5 hours. Their only window was plexiglass 6 inches thick. Somewhere on the way down, they heard a loud crack. The outer pane had fractured under a pressure of roughly 16,000 pounds per square inch. They were at that moment hours from the surface with no possibility of assistance from anyone. They continued. They reached the bottom around 10,900 meters and stayed for 20 minutes. The landing threw up a cloud of sediment that never settled. Walsh later described the view as looking into a bowl of milk, and in that 20 minutes, Piccard reported seeing a fish. He wrote about it in National Geographic that August. A flatfish, he said. Something like a sole roughly a foot long with two round eyes on the top of its head. He described it noticing them and swimming slowly away into the sediment. That observation went into textbooks. It was, for decades, the single most famous piece of evidence that life exists at the very bottom of the ocean. The problem is that it cannot be true. The Challenger Deep is 2.5 kilometers below the line where fish stop, and the man who calculated that line is one of the authors of a 2012 paper examining the sighting in detail and concluding that whatever Pickard saw, it was not a fish. The leading suggestion made decades earlier by a Danish biologist is a sea cucumber, a flattened, oval, bottom-dwelling animal that in stirred sediment through cracked plexiglass could look like almost anything. Walsh was still alive when the paper was published, and he did something that people in his position very rarely do. He said the critics might be right. He pointed out that Pickard was at the window and he was not, that neither of them was a trained biologist, and that the sediment made everything nearly impossible to see. Jacques Pickard died in 2008. He did not live to read the paper, and he never withdrew the account. Below 8,000 meters with no fish left, the trenches belong to invertebrates, amphipods mostly, small crustaceans related distantly to shrimp present in enormous numbers, recovered from beyond 10,000 meters. Some scavenge whatever falls, some hunt each other. They are the last complex animals in the descent, and they are thriving in a place that killed every vertebrate lineage that tried it. They have been sampled and analyzed, and here is what the analysis found. Their tissues contain industrial pollutants, persistent organic compounds, the kind manufactured in the middle of the 20th century and banned decades ago, in concentrations that in some measurements exceed what is found in animals living in heavily industrialized coastal rivers. Nothing manufactured has ever been used down there. Nothing has ever been spilled there. These animals live in the most isolated habitat on the surface of this planet, 10 kilometers below anything, at the bottom of a hole that fish cannot enter. The chemicals fell. They bound to particles at the surface and to the marine snow and to the bodies of things that died, and they descended for years, and they collected in the deepest place available. Because the deepest place available is where everything eventually collects. There is one more thing on that sea floor, photographed at nearly 11,000 meters, a plastic bag 10,900 meters. There is nowhere further down to go. We are going back up now. Everything we passed on the way down is still there. That is worth saying plainly, because a film like this can make the deep ocean feel like a story, and it is not a story. It is a place, and it is there tonight, and everything described in the last hour is happening in it at this moment. The snow is falling. Something is being eaten on a whale skeleton in the Pacific. The tracks from 1979 are exactly as they were, and so are the ships. On the 4th of March 1918, a United States Navy collier called the Cyclops left Barbados carrying manganese ore, bound for Baltimore. She never arrived. There was no distress signal. No wreckage was recovered. No body was recovered. There was no storm reported along her route, and the Navy searched and found nothing, and has found nothing since 306 people were aboard. It remains the largest loss of life in the history of the United States Navy not involving combat. More than a century later, the official position is unchanged. The cause of the disappearance is unknown. She is somewhere. That is the only thing anyone can say with confidence. Somewhere on the floor of the Western Atlantic, there is a ship with 306 people in it, and it has been sitting there since the year before the First World War ended, and nobody knows the coordinates within hundreds of kilometers. The opposite case is a Soviet submarine, and the opposite case is worse. The K-278 Komsomolets was the deepest diving military submarine ever built. titanium hull. It had gone to over 1,000 meters on trials, deeper than any combat submarine before or since. On the 7th of April 1989, on patrol in the Norwegian Sea, a fire started in the rear compartment. The crew fought it. They shut down the reactor. They got the submarine to the surface, which by any reasonable standard means they won. A nuclear submarine on fire at depth, brought up, reactor safe, hull intact enough to float. Then it sank anyway, and the men were in the water. The Norwegian Sea in April is a few degrees above freezing. Rescue was hours away. Of the 69 men aboard, 42 died, and a large number of them did not die in the fire and did not drown. They died of cold, on the surface, in the open air, waiting. The submarine went down to 1,680 meters, and it is still there, and it is sitting upright. It has a nuclear reactor in it. It has 2 torpedoes with plutonium warheads in it. In 1994, Russian teams sealed the damaged torpedo compartment with titanium plugs. Those plugs have held. 30 years of sampling has found no evidence of plutonium escaping from the warheads, and that is the good news, and it is the only good news. In 2019, a Norwegian expedition put a remotely operated vehicle onto the wreck and sampled the water directly at the hull. At a ventilation pipe, they measured cesium at something on the order of 800,000 times the level of uncontaminated seawater. The analysis of that survey was published in 2026. The leak is not steady. It comes in bursts from specific points along the hull. The ventilation pipe, a grill on the conning tower, the area around the reactor. The isotope ratios show that the nuclear fuel inside is corroding. The radiation drops away sharply within a few meters of the wreck, diluted by an ocean that is very large. The sediment shows nothing unusual. By the standards of what could have happened, this is close to the best available outcome. And it will continue for as long as there is anything left to corrode, which is longer than any institution currently monitoring it is likely to exist. One of the researchers described the wreck as looking like it had sunk recently. 37 years down there, and it does not look like a wreck. It looks like a submarine. There is no register of what is on the seafloor. UNESCO's working estimate for the number of shipwrecks in the world's oceans is around 3 million. That number is an estimate built on other estimates, and it covers everything from Bronze Age traders to container ships, and nobody defends it as precise. What it does convey is the shape of the thing. 3,000 years of people going out on the water, and a proportion of them not coming back, accumulating on the bottom in no particular order, in a place where, as we established 2 acts ago, very little changes and almost nothing is removed. Most of them have never been found. Most of them never will be. There is no marker on any of them, and there is no list of who is aboard. And this is what it looks like from up here. Water, a horizon. The same view people have had from the deck of a ship for as long as there have been ships. And it shows you absolutely nothing about what is underneath it. That has been the honest theme of everything in this film. Not that the deep ocean is hostile. It is not hostile. It is indifferent, which is a different and much larger thing. Every horror in the last hour came from the same source, which is that a place exists which is enormous and permanent and almost entirely unobserved, and we have been living on top of it and putting things into it and losing people in it for our entire history. The surface does not record any of it, it just keeps moving.